Think about the word prosperity. What comes to mind? For many of us, prosperity means that we have the resources to be able to afford food, shelter, and provide the other necessities of life. However, for others, access to even these basic needs is a luxury. So how do we ensure that everyone has access to the resources they need to thrive? Hey there. You're listening to The Brief, an Alberta Better podcast series. I'm Brittany Brander, and in this series, my co-host, Scott Crockett, and I explore Alberta's big challenges, celebrate stories of growth, innovation, and prosperity, and discover bold ideas to make life better for Albertans. On today's episode, we're talking to the Bissell Centre CEO, Gary St. Amand, a pioneer in the Edmonton social services space and a fierce advocate for safety and wellness for all Albertans. And as CEO for the last 10 years, Gary has been committed to the centre's mission of working with people and communities to empower people out of poverty and into economic, social, and cultural prosperity. And while this is no easy task, Gary knows just how possible it can be when we come together with one goal in mind. So Gary discusses the progress to date in addressing some of Edmonton's challenges on houselessness and poverty, and how we can tackle these challenges and create sustainable solutions and truly support people to thrive. And if you found this episode interesting or insightful, let us know by heading over to Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcasts, and give us a quick review and rating. Now, on to the show. All right. Well, Gary, thank you so much for joining our podcast today. We're really excited to get a frontline perspective on just some of the issues facing Edmonton. Before we get into that, can you just share with our listeners a little bit more about who you are, what you do, and that passion behind it? Why do you do it?
Yeah, so I am the CEO of Bissell Centre. I'm actually coming in on 10 years this December.
Wow.
And
Congratulations.
Thank you. It's been, quite an incredible journey to be part of this, and have been in Edmonton for about 12 and a half years now, and been involved in this work for better part of moving on 3 decades. I'm starting to date myself here, but so lots of, experience around some of the challenges around how we operate as communities, and what does it look like to be healthy and well as individuals, as families, as communities. And I think, the driver for me really comes down to a few key things. But one is I grew up in a core neighborhood in Winnipeg, and spent a lot of my life as a young person sort of engaged in watching the impacts of people who were experiencing poverty and homelessness really firsthand, right? And often our own family sort of living on the edge of that reality, and thinking about, as I started to move into adulthood, I actually wanted to be a computer software programmer at one point, an Air Force pilot, had lots of different dreams, but, fundamentally, as I started to, sort of move into that space of, what really am I going to do here, realized that I was really passionate about helping communities and people find wholeness, and wanted to feel like, the work, when I go to work every day, I can see the impact and the benefit of what I'm doing in a really tangible way.
Yeah. And it sounds like, because the next question I want to ask you is a little bit more about Bissell and the mission and just the notions of prosperity. You talked about community wellness and kind of wholeness. So, you have this mission that is working with communities. I'm just going to read it. Working with communities, we empower people to move from poverty to cultural, social, and economic prosperity. Now, we're a business council. We get economic prosperity very well. And, in many ways, a little bit more on the social prosperity. But what do kind of those 3 types of prosperity mean? And because cultural prosperity isn't something that we typically think of when we think of prosperity. I think when we think of prosperity, it is wealth, it is that growth, economic success. So can you just talk a little bit about what those terms mean and kind of the connective tissue between them?
Yeah, and I think we picked those 3 terms to really kind of highlight 3 sort of anchor spots of what could have been many ways we could have framed that concept of prosperity around that, right? And so there's a bit of a literary device there to say, holistically, how are we being prosperous? Because if we had just, previously we had just used the word prosper, but our challenge is that often gets owned in that very, narrow economic sort of sense of the word, right? And I think we all can look at our own lives and realize that we're not defined only economically, right? That our story as a human being and in our community is much broader than that. And so why we targeted those 3 were, really specific around saying, we all know that the economics matter. So what we're not trying to say is economics don't matter. It actually is important. People need to be able to have sustainable incomes, good livelihoods, all of that stuff. So that's really critical. But we also need to realize that that social side of those things is really important. So for example, we can see in our own data with the folks that we support that if you have a strong personal support network, your housing sustainability goes way up. So there's a correlation between those things, right? And so the social side isn't just about being warm and fuzzy. It actually is really a critical part of being able to, I like to use the language of sustainably interdependent. None of us lives alone, doesn't rely on anything, right? We all have systems or others that we connect with to do that. So if I hit a tough spot, can sort of call up, mom and dad and say, hey, here, I need a bit of help or whatever, right? So what does that look like in terms of, those social things, in terms of building resilience and people's ability to thrive and do well in their communities? And then the cultural piece really is a broad piece, thinking about diversity in our communities and in our lives, our organizations. But fundamentally, I think for us, given that we have such a high representation of Indigenous peoples accessing services far out of sync with what the demographic is relative to the city of Edmonton at large. And, that's true in many of the large systems that are like health and police and justice. And so, we think about, well, what does it mean when cultures or a culture has been so oppressed and not allowed to thrive and prosper? And how has that been so harmful? And we're living and seeing the very real effects of that as a country, right? And so it's really important that we go, it's not just our social connections, it's not just the economy, but actually as people groups, we need to create space for that prosperity to exist.
That's great. And Gary, Bissell's really well known in Edmonton and known across Alberta a bit as well, but folks are listening from all over the country. So we'll ask you that hard question, sum up what you do for us in 30 seconds, give us a little snapshot.
Okay, so Bissell has been supporting people in Edmonton and region for about 112 years now. Originally, we were founded in 1910, and our mission has always been focused on helping people, but the more unique mandate, interestingly, at this point in our global timeline, is that it started helping Ukrainian immigrants coming into Edmonton to land well. And so that, feels like it's a bit of a full circle piece. And now we have other partners like Edmonton Mennonite Center for Newcomers and others who are doing, great work in that area. And so we were partnering with them around those things. But fundamentally, that has been our journey. And so we have, when I look through our history records, there's really incredible moments where, we've been supporting folks like Japanese students in our childcare during World War II and some of the stuff that went on in World War II, or Indigenous people in the 40s. One of my favorite stories is that we have a picture of a group of leaders, Indigenous leaders, who came together at Bissell when it was illegal to gather in groups larger than 10, and made changes to the Indian Act that then went to Ottawa and actually many of them were implemented. And Bissell isn't the hero in that story, really, it's those leaders, but just an example of how the work that we do. So maybe to get more directly to your question, the work that we do is really, I call it sort of that micro, meso, and macro. So micro level is we help families and individuals move out of poverty. So what does that look like from an income, housing, all the things that they might need? Then we talk about community development. So how people land better, like we were just talking about, in healthier communities. So how do we help communities be healthy? And so that's more of an aspirational side of our work, but certainly something we're very interested in continuing to develop. And then the third piece of that is really that macro level. So like the systems that we have created, the policies, the structures, they really can impact how people experience poverty or not. And so part of our work is trying to show and demonstrate through what people are experiencing on the ground, the impacts of the policies that are being made in the different orders of government and in the community.
So why don't we start the conversation sort of anchoring in where we're at today, if we could. What's the state of poverty and houselessness, particularly in Edmonton at the moment? What do we need to know?
Yeah, I don't think I can tell you anything that people don't already know in that really broad sense, that, the challenge of the pandemic has really exacerbated the impacts that are, being experienced by cities across the globe, really, around poverty and houselessness. And I think that what we saw is that the pieces that were not funded well, the systemic pieces that were just not well resourced, those things I think would have shown up eventually along the way, but that was accelerated. And so we just saw cracks in the system. And we had seen up to the beginning of the pandemic, there was almost a 40% decline in houselessness in the city of Edmonton. And now, we're
kind of an untold story. Or
yeah, right. Like, no, it was actually working, right? Like we were actually seeing that. And I mean, I think there was still work that needed to be done. It wasn't perfect, but like we had actually seen a pretty coordinated, a systematic effort to do that. And then the challenge is that, we just had a houselessness count just recently that we're waiting to see the results on. But anecdotally, I think we can say that, based on our experience and our partners' experience that we're hearing is that, we think that those numbers have since doubled in 3 years again. And so now systems that have been funded at this level are being asked to do this much work and are under significant strain, and they were already under strain, right? And so I think we're seeing the effects of that in terms of people having limited access, and then that the impacts in the community around some of the public disorder pieces and those things that I think people who aren't as connected into that might notice.
So a doubling in 3 years, and after all that good progress beforehand, yeah, it really paints a picture. I know at your center, you asked the question, what does a poverty-free future look like? So can I pose that to you? Maybe in two parts. What does a poverty-free future look like to you? And is that possible? Can we get there, or is that just an aspirational end of the rainbow sort of objective?
Okay, I'm going to answer your second question first. I love that you asked it. It's a great question. And I actually just every time we have an orientation for new staff, I go into the orientation. We do a bit of a briefing with me or one of our senior team members. And the question we ask them is exactly that. So do you think we can end poverty? And it's kind of fun because they're all looking at the CEO of this organization who has elimination of poverty as the vision. And are we allowed to say no? Right. And so we talk about that. And so I did that this morning, actually, coincidentally. And the group said, yeah, a couple said, no, I don't think we can do that. And I said, okay, so the people who designed this statement, they knew that was a criticism. Why do you think they kept that there? Why did they still put it in? Because it's pretty audacious, right? Mm-hmm. And so we bantered that around, and really in the end, the piece that we try to bring home to them is, if we see poverty from a reduction perspective, it's like trying to say, well, let's take a part of cancer out mm-hmm. of the body, right? It's like it just will continue to spread. We actually have to deal with the root issues to get at really solving it. And when we only see it as something that we can sort of help people one by one, what we don't do is look like what's coming upstream, like what's going on upstream that's causing this reality here, right? So that old metaphor of people, you help someone who's caught up in the river, you pull them out, you help another person, you pull them out, you help a third person, finally you put a net across the river, then you build watchtowers, and and obviously you have all this infrastructure, but does anybody ever ask why are people falling in the river in the first place, right?
Right.
And so I think what we say is, when you put that as your vision statement, the elimination of poverty, it forces you to ask this wicked question: is what would need to be true for us to eliminate poverty in our community? And then when you ask that, you get back to those ideas of, well, the structures are actually part of what's creating it, and communities that aren't healthy are part of that reality, and people that don't have the right supports. And so then we start to target it. And so I say to our group, it's not really meant to be like, can it be true or not, but what does it force you to do? What kinds of questions does it make you ask? And then how do you sort of create urgency and intentionality around that, right? And so that's why we have that vision.
Which I absolutely love. And I actually want to ask you about those root causes of what it would take to get to that point. Now, I know that could be 2 more podcasts, and we've done some other ones with End Poverty Edmonton and Vibrant Communities Calgary and other folks like that, where we've dug into it. But I wonder if you could just, top line for us, what are a few of those big rocks you think that we need to move to get to a community where poverty is eliminated or poverty isn't a reality anymore?
The easy answer would be like big sort of like, well, we need to deal with, these policy shifts, right? But I want to actually go one layer deeper than that and say, it really is about the narratives that we tell each other as society. And so I was actually speaking at another engagement just recently, and I said to people, we have houselessness in our community because we choose to have houselessness in our community. And we choose to have it because of the narratives that we tell each other and then believe, and then we act accordingly to those narratives. And so if we could understand the stories and I'll explain what I mean by that in a minute, that those things are based on, then we could actually, make the shifts that we need to do. And so one of the examples I'll use maybe is around the idea of public disorder, right? And so often when we talk about houselessness, what for a lot of people come up is public disorder. And while the two are obviously connected, in very real way to each other, they're not the same thing, right? And so sometimes when I'm having conversations with people and they say, okay, we want to talk about ending houselessness. Okay, so we go to the meeting, and what I realize is what we're doing is we're talking about ending public disorder. We're not talking about ending houselessness. And the difference for me is who's the beneficiary. And so if the beneficiary is the residents, the business owners, like the house residents and business owners and other folks, then that's a public disorder conversation. If the beneficiary is a person experiencing houselessness, that's a houselessness conversation, right? And the reality is, when we keep trying to throw money at solving public disorder, we're actually just addressing a surface symptom, and we use safety as the narrative at which we want to then throw money. And so then it becomes a criminal conversation, right? It's a conversation about justice and criminality and those kinds of things. When in reality, the narrative that actually should be behind this is narrative around it's a public health issue. Actually, this is really connected to health, not just mental health, but actually physical health. And so lots of neurological challenges, lots of people have diabetes and other things that are just driving very difficult realities. But then there's also a reality around that cultural side, where we have seen intergenerational trauma and some of the really significant, in Canada in particular, impacts of that. And Edmonton is, has a very high population of Indigenous communities in around our area, and so the effects of that are very live and real, right? And so I think it's really, if the story is it's about my safety and how I feel it going into the community, then I don't really care about the issue of houselessness or that person who is experiencing houselessness. I just care about the challenge of public disorder. But if you try to solve public disorder, you'll never. It's chasing the pot of gold
at the end of the rainbow. Yeah.
I
like your point on why are people falling in the river to begin with. Having said that, I do want to pull the thread of safety for a moment with you, because that's something that we've been talking about on this podcast all year. Many large cities in Alberta are talking about safety issues in their downtowns: Edmonton, Calgary, Lethbridge, Red Deer. We even had Mayor Sohi on here not long ago, and he expressed some concerns about that too. What's your view as a frontline service provider of these issues, and how serious is the safety issue from your perspective?
So safety is really critical. I mean, safe communities are fundamental, right? One of the questions, though, that I think we need to ask about is whose safety are we talking about? So often when I get into conversations about safety, people are thinking about, well, my safety as I'm walking down the street, and we saw in Edmonton an escalation of some really tense things happening politically, and some challenging and obviously heartbreaking situations that happened in terms of some of the murders and those pieces, and it created this real focus around the idea that people experiencing houselessness are all dangerous, right? And in our community, as we're having conversations, there were so many people that were terrified and really, really afraid that they would be victims to people taking vigilante justice acts, to being ignored when they need help from people in the community, those kinds of things, right? And so their safety is a very complex issue when you start to say, well, wait a second, let's dig one layer deeper than that and really explore what that is. And again, I think that the challenge here really comes down to, in my opinion, around the investment in the right diverse range of housing and supports around that. Like, I think that's such a critical part of, if we really want to resolve this, we need to think about what does it mean to help folks find housing and be sustainable in that housing. And the answer is, it's not a cheap solution. It's actually not complicated. We just don't really want to, and that's where I get back to that idea of the story we tell ourselves. We don't want to make the investment, governments don't want to make the investments into housing in such a robust way, because it's not a popular thing from a voter perspective, right? And so if you think about the levers, if from the public, politicians heard, you know what? Houselessness is the number one issue. It's on par with the economy. If
Mhm.
we don't deal with this, we will have lack of safety, and then we'll have lack of investment in our communities. And so actually, even in our own interest, as you know, in the community, this is actually a critical issue. Then politicians are motivated to say, okay, the investment here makes sense, right? And so then I think you can start to see those pieces come into place in a way that actually can move the needle more substantially.
Well, and you talk about investments, Gary, because I wanted to bring that up. There's been some noise made about how much Edmonton is or is not investing into these areas and where that money is exactly going. So I wonder if you could just give us your perspective on, where are we spending the money and where do you think we should be spending the money?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and there was the report that was released, a little while ago, maybe a year or so ago, that talked about sort of $7.5 billion being put into the
Yeah, that's the
community.
one we were referring to.
Yeah, safety net, and I think if when you look at that report, really, I think the point that the chief of police and police commissioner are trying to make is look, we have big systems that are coordinating poorly amongst themselves. And so there's big investment going into these things. And if we could coordinate and align these in a much more significant way, we could actually leverage a lot of resources that are already existing in the community to address some of these issues in a more effective way. And I agree with that. I think that that's actually very true. I think the way some of the language is sometimes interpreted from that document, it sounds like $7.5 billion is going to, little agencies like ours in the community. And boy, you're just not really getting a lot of return for your, and honestly, if you gave, if that was true,
if we were sending you 7.5 billion, yeah,
and we're not, and this is, then I would feel frustrated with us too, right? Like that's would be a poor investment, but we're actually talking, like a percentage of that is going into Edmonton's, like such a nominal amount relative to that amount, because in that amount is including education and health and first responders and all these different systems, as well as other nonprofits that are more broadly dealing with issues in the community. And so when you start to break down actually what's being delivered towards houselessness and these issues in the core of Edmonton, it becomes actually a very small amount of money, right? And so it's probably, I couldn't do the math in my head, but it's more in the few $100 million, which is not insignificant, but it's certainly a far cry from $1 billion, right? And I think the challenge is that a lot of those dollars, they'll get diverted towards addressing public disorder often, and not sort of some of the root issues, right? And so then I think that's where it really becomes down to the space of, well, what are we really doing? What's really behind that? And so I think we actually need $1 billion. And I say that not as like I can give you a breakdown of a budget, but I like it's really about trying to say, this is the kind of scale that we actually need to get at the issue in Edmonton. Like, so I think if we actually did put some reasonable resources around housing and those things, we would actually start to see that significant shift, and then actually your downtown will start to feel safer, and your all those things will start to be the side products. But if we can keep those people experiencing homelessness or houselessness at the center of that space, and understand what does it mean for us to make sure that they're getting what they need to be sustainable in the community, then I think the other stuff comes as a result.
Mm-hmm. So you're saying if we had $1 billion, we could make some impact here. So thinking about that, what we want to celebrate some of the wins that you have had. You talked about 40% reduction in houselessness in Edmonton, and that's a huge accomplishment, and definitely a story we're not telling. COVID obviously kind of took us back a little bit. But when you think about the tactics and the strategies that led to that, what has worked really well, and what do you think you would spend that $1 billion on doing?
Yeah, I think so. The 10-year plan to end homelessness, which obviously is past 10 years, and so some of the criticism as well that it didn't work because you didn't get there. But the reality is, in my 12 plus years of being here, it's the one, coordinated effort that has, we have shown needle moving scale at, right? And so even though we didn't get to zero, it was working. And so I think the question that we need to ask ourselves is, what was the heart of that was, effective? And what is our new reality, given that we're not going back to those days in the past? And so how do we build forward together, using those past successes? And so I'd say one of the things, and that I think was really central to that is, we had Homer Trust as our community-based organization in Edmonton coordinating that plan. And that coordination, really is such a critical part of that. And so sometimes we get accused of not collaborating, and we actually do collaborate a lot. But the reality is the coordination is really what's required. It's easy to collaborate on smaller projects and do different things, but coordinating big systems takes a lot of work and investment of resources, right? And so I think the first thing would be that we really need to invest in that coordination effort. And how do we get there? And to think about the scale of the issues and the scale of the responses. Like sometimes what happens is we get a response thrown out and it sounds like a lot of money, but really, when you sort of do the math on it, it's actually a 1% response to the 100% of that issue, right? And so what we need a much larger response to some of the challenges. In specific, I think in our community, one of the things that we have lacked really good investment in is our permanent supportive housing options, or supportive housing options. And I think that has been something that we are seeing in during the pandemic, really was a challenge then, because there were folks that were just not being able to survive or be sustainable in market housing in the community. With some supports, they actually needed on-site 24/7 supports, and we just didn't have that available. And so that's been one of the, I think, really big underlying challenges. And part of that is that capital investment, that infrastructure, not only to start it, but to keep it maintained over time, is very expensive, right? And so there's a reticence to want to invest in those things.
Not just to build it, but to maintain it over time. I wanted to ask you a quick terminology check question, because I noticed we're typically using in this conversation, we're mostly using the term houselessness as opposed to what might have previously been homelessness. Is the distinction between those important to you? And for anyone listening to this, what term do you like to use and do you recommend?
Yeah, and I've probably slipped up and said homelessness because I just out of habit over the long, and I think it's, as always, like language evolves, and we're trying, part of, I think, what's happening around the word of houselessness versus homelessness is about precision. And so the idea is, what do we mean by a home? And what are we actually doing? And so in terms of the work that we're doing as a community around that issue of houselessness. And so for some people, it's, my home is far more than my house. So
Certainly.
When you're putting me in a house, you're not giving me a home, you're giving me a house. Hopefully I can make a home, out of that. Right. But there's also people who are, living in camps in the River Valley, let's say, who are saying, it may not be a house, but this is my home right now. Right. And I have friends and I have connections and I have community here. Right. And so we're trying to say, well, listen, we're actually not trying to create homes. This is really a very niche, specific thing that we're trying to do, is get people access to housing. And so that's why some of that shift in terminology.
Precision.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. In a previous conversation, Gary, you and I had, you said something really interesting to me that I hope you don't mind me repeating. And we were talking about measurement, and nothing gets business people excited quite like key performance indicators.
OKRs.
Yeah, KPIs and measurement. And you were talking about as an example, I'm going to sort of try and paraphrase, and you can say it in your own words, that if we only measure the number of meals we give out, for example, we're probably measuring the wrong thing. And in fact, if that number goes up, we might pat ourselves on the back, when in fact we might be actually making the problem worse, or certainly not making it any better. Tell me in your own words, how do you sort of see that, and what measurements do you think we need to be more focused on?
There's a great study that was done called the Cambridge Somerville Youth Study, where a group of youth in a community in the US were in detention centers. And as they were coming out of the detention centers, this group of researchers noticed that one group was being part of this mentorship program that had been started during that period. And there was another group that weren't connected to that mentorship program. And they said, well, you know what, here's a great research project. Let's do a longitudinal study and let's see what happens with these youth who, as they grow up, who were part of the program or not, and what was the benefit of the program. And what they were really, I think, trying to do was support the benefit of the program and how
Right.
how impactful it was. So then decades later, the researchers actually followed up with these youth as adults, and just by some really interesting coincidences and ways that they had designed the study, they were able to access a bunch of the social and economic indicator data for these folks that they like. Now we probably go to jail for accessing some of that
Right.
data, but then they could see it, right? And they could so it really created this space where they could measure what impacts were going on in their lives, but also they were able to follow up with a lot of those young people and talk about their experience in the program and what that meant to them. And so what was interesting is, as they talked with the youth who were part of the program, and they said, what was your experience? And the youth would be saying, oh man, I had such a great experience. I wouldn't be where I am with without my mentor, and it was so helpful and whatever. But then when they looked at the social and economic indicator data, it actually was those youth that weren't in the program, weren't getting that help, actually were faring significantly better than those youth that were in the program. Better.
Really? Those who were not in the program were faring better. Okay. You've intrigued.
So, right. Yeah, exactly. And so to the point where one of the researchers whose mother had been one of the original researchers, because of course this had gone on for decades, was a volunteer in the program, actually immediately stopped being a volunteer because they said, I'm actually causing harm. I'm not actually being helpful here. And so there's been lots of conversation about, well, what really was going on there and why was that true and all those things. But I think the point for me, the lesson for me was, we make assumptions about, well, if I do a good work with good intention, it will result in a good outcome. And that's not necessarily true. And so we have to ask ourselves, just in the same way, medicine will say, well, yeah, it makes sense to try this and do this, but then we do all the, the controlled studies, and all of a sudden we go, no, that thing actually is a harmful, thing, not a helpful thing, or has unintended impacts that are worse than the benefits that it's creating, right? And so we have to, I think about that, and it's difficult to do that in a social context because those measures and ethics and all those things get complicated. But what we did is we created a system where we said, okay, it's not perfect, but I think it really does a good job. It's something that we're using and modifying out of the US that's had a lot of research around it, where we actually are asking folks as they come in and do an intake at Bissell about sort of some of their key, indicators of what's going on in the journey. That helps us refer them and support them. But it also gives us a measure point. And then later we follow at different points along their journey. How are you doing? And we ask those same sets of questions, and then we can start to compare and contrast. And so then the question is, so for example, in your housing, did you actually improve on it's called a self-sufficiency matrix. So did your self-sufficiency improve, or did it get worse, and why? And what were the attribution or contribution points to those changes? And so then that allows us to start to say, okay, where are we actually having impact in people's lived reality of poverty and houselessness versus, hey, we just gave you a bunch of meals? Because I can tell you right now that, over 18 months, from May till I think it was July or whatever the actual date was, we served almost 200,000 meals out of our space. It's a lot of food. And you hear that number, you're like, wow, that feels great, right?
Yeah.
And people want to yeah, right? But fundamentally, that number, and that's critical. People can't move forward if they don't have food in their stomach. So I'm not in any way trying to diminish the value of that. But at the same time, if that's where it ends, actually, I worry that we're causing more harm than good, that we're sort of trying to make poverty and houselessness comfortable without actually creating pathways for people to move out of it, right? And so it's other stats that we have, like, for example, we did about 4,000 free tax returns with people as part of our financial empowerment programs. Well, the folks who were accessing that service got $6.5 million of money in their pockets during that period, not because government made a special contribution, but because it was actually just part of what our normal systems, tax system, was available to them, right? So, and then we know that, like, those dollars, we conceive it takes very little, it's less money than people think for people to live sustainably, and so one example that I have is back in the days where we had the progressive conservative government. They made a change to AISH where they moved it from about $1,100 to about $1,400, and the numbers are a little rough there, but it was about a $300 or so a month increase. And we could see in our own data that people's housing sustainability spiked at $1,400 a month and dropped pretty dramatically at $1,100. And so we were able to take that back to the GOA at the time and say, this was actually a good decision. This is actually making a big difference. Yeah.
That's some fabulous stories there. And also interesting because, tax returns filled out is not quite, doesn't get the pulse moving quite as quickly as, hungry bellies fed, but actually might have, a really, really significant impact over the long term as those folks could access programs that they wouldn't otherwise be able to.
Yeah.
As we begin to head it on the close here, Gary, I wanted to talk about, we were fortunate enough to have you participate in the Business Council's Define the Decade project, a big 10-year economic strategy for Alberta. You're part of the Prosperity Advisory Committee, and that meant that we were bringing community leaders and business leaders together to sort of work on the big issues to move this province forward. One of the things that resulted in, I think, is, business people talking a little bit more about social issues, framing some of those issues in economic terms. Do you think it's important to frame social issues in economic terms? What's kind of your view of that? Do you think that helps?
Yes, I think it's, you have to be careful always, like with your measures, because it's very easy to have unintended impacts in very negative ways. So I say that in a general yes, but in the specificity, I think we need to be cautious at the same time. But I was joking with someone the other day. I said, I'm not a libertarian because it's not in my own best interest. And and not to poke fun at the libertarian position, but just to say that fundamentally, it's one thing to make a life for ourselves, but the reality is we have to live the life that we're making in a community. And so if we only think from an individualistic perspective and not from that sort of broader community perspective, then we're left with this dichotomy of what is my experience individually while I try to live it in a community that's struggling. And I think that's the reality of some of the public disorder conversation we're having earlier. So coming back to your framing here, I first want to say thank you to the Business Council of Alberta for letting me be part of that initiative. It was fantastic.
Oh, we're so happy to have you.
Thank you. No, that it was, I've said this to you folks before, but it's worth saying again. We get asked to be part of, a lot of different consultation groups and things along the way. And I have to say that there often is a pattern where you realize that people are checking a box saying that they did it, and then they're going to do what they said anyways, or that they're, what you said just becomes sort of like a platitude in statement that doesn't actually have tangible stuff. And what I really appreciated about the Business Council of Alberta's initiative, this Define the Decade initiative, was that there was a prosperity advisory committee, that you were intentional about saying, what, this matters, that all Albertans are thought about in this process, not just folks that sit in the business community or in certain economic classes or et cetera, et cetera. And then I think I was really personally impressed when I would give feedback that I was pretty sure you were going to push back on as a group and say, where are you coming from? And you went, and then I would see the changes in the next iteration, and it made me realize that you folks were really working hard to actually engage with the reality, which I thought was very complex because you did such a broad consultation across Alberta. Like, it was amazing. And so it's a very special project. And I think, kudos to you folks for trying to hold all of those very real tensions in space and trying to think about it beyond just what's good just for the business community. And I think that was amazing.
Well, thank you.
You're gonna make me cry. That is so sweet. Thanks so much, Gary. So as we wrap up here, I just have one final question for you, and it's a pretty hard one. Do you have any final thoughts, any word of wisdom or insight or policy idea that you want to leave our listeners with?
I think that probably I would come back to what I said around the investment in housing. But I think fundamentally that the layer I'll add to that is just to tie back to that story is, our systems, like some of our social support systems, were built with a mindset back decades ago of mistrust, that people would abuse the system. And I sometimes will say a little facetiously that we'll spend $10 to make sure that $1 of abuse doesn't happen. Right. And so I think that we are due for an overhaul of those social infrastructure systems and nets in a web or safety nets in a way that actually can not have so much of, I'm not saying we should throw all caution to the wind, but that we can actually think more hopefully with and together with folks experiencing poverty and houselessness, and say, what actually could we, how could we reallocate the resources that we have in a way that are fundamentally going to move the needle on issues, as opposed to, just sort of put a bit of balm on an issue that and not really deal with the root causes.
Well, what a perfect place to leave it, Gary, because we are always down for a major rethink of how we're deploying investments to be more efficient. So we're cheering you on in that regard and happy to work with you further on it. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Well, thank you for joining us for this episode of the Brief, an Alberta Better podcast series. This podcast is a production of the Business Council of Alberta, and you can learn more about us at businesscouncilab.com. We'd love to connect with you on social media, so give us a follow at BizCouncilAB on Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, TikTok, and YouTube. And finally, don't forget to subscribe, rate the show, and give us a quick review. Your support helps us to keep making more episodes. Alberta Better is available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcasts. New episodes drop every other Tuesday. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.